I hope I pronounce it well. Probably not on native French, but so first I have a question. Is the Paris the 15-minute city?
Not really.
Régis će nam pričati o putu do održivog upravljanja muljem i iskustvima iz Francuske. Régis, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So the idea of this presentation is to give you an overview of how we manage sludge in France. First of all, some figures about the wastewater treatment plant we have in France. So far, there is about more than 22,000 plants in France. And on this graph, I give you the repartition of the plant depending on their treatment capacity. And the world treatment capacity in France is higher than 1,000 million people equivalent. But you have to keep in mind that more than 75 plants have a treatment capacity lower than 20 people population equivalent. That means that there are only a few huge wastewater treatment plants. And I would like to give you some information about how the sludge management evolved with time. And I will keep on the last 25 years. And the situation in France between 1998 and 2004 was as follows. The uses of sludge on this graph in percent, 60% of the sludge were used for agricultural spreading, 18% for incineration, and 20% for landfill and 2% for other purposes. And as you can see, there is some discrepancies between area in France or administrative region, because it's not always the same type of use of sludge that will follow, and the most is agricultural landfill. But if we compare to the situation today, the last figures are from 2022, you can see that there is no more landfill. It down from 20 to less than 1% within 25 years. Sludge spreading increased from 60 to 84%. And one of the main reasons for that is the regulation evolution, because in France, we started to implement some new law about circular economy. Therefore, there is a move from a landfill to other sludge treatment. The stock of dry sludge is more than 1 million tons in France of dry matter, which is equivalent to the production of 15 kilograms per capita per people. And as you can see on this graph now, composting plus sludge spreading, which is the equivalent to agricultural purposes, is more than 84%. Just to make a comparison, the situation in the Paris conurbation, because Paris represents almost 12% of the French population. What we observe is that sludge spreading is 29%, composting 31%, which is equivalent to 60% of the use of sludge for agricultural purposes. But what is quite interesting is the methanination, because 3% of the sludge in the Paris region are used for methanization. And this is quite new. So my presentation will focus on these three aspects: sludge spreading, composting, and methanination. And the chapter here are chapters from the book you have all in your back. Why do we use sludge on soil or crops so much in France? Because there's first an agronomic benefits, because you can implement soil with some nutrients which are not chemical fertilizer. As a consequence, there is also economic interest, because this is a low-cost process, because you don't have to buy chemical fertilizer. And finally, there is environmental benefits, because you are recycling waste from wastewater treatment plant. However, this practice must be supervised, and it started to be regulated in France since 1989, because there was a need to reassure consumer association who were concerned about the transfer of pollutant from sludge to soil and from soil to crops and to the final consumer, who are us. So what happened? Today, the regulation we are following for sludge management in France are mainly European regulations. Some of them I've already mentioned, but the most important in France is the urban wastewater treatment from 1991, the directive from 1991, which is going to be recast, and I will show in my conclusion the consequence of this recast. But in the French regulations are also very important, and one I will focus on is the order of January 8, 1998, which is dealing on the technological requirement applicable to the spreading of sludge in agricultural land. I will focus on this one. So, before you started an agricultural spreading of sludge, you have to keep in mind this is a multi-stage procedure. The first stage is a pre-study. The owner of the wastewater treatment plant have to perform a pre-study, and the idea is to choose the best spreading method, because you can spread sludge as liquid sludge or solid sludge. The second sludge is about the wastewater treatment plant development, because if you spread sludge, you have to build a sludge storage, but also to build a thickening system to reduce the quantity of sludge you have to spread. The third stage of this spreading is the spreading planification. You have to organize the spreading operation, to sign some agreement with farmers, or the end users, and some organization responsible of the agronomic monitoring of sludge spreading. And the end of this third stage is to provide or to submit an administrative declaration or authorization file to the local authorities. And the fourth stage is the spreading monitoring itself, and I will focus on this point thereafter. So who are involved in agricultural spreading? First of all, the owner of the wastewater treatment plant, which could be either the community, but sometimes the operation of the management of the wastewater treatment plant is given to a private company, but if it is the case, the private company should be involved in the spreading plan. Then you have to provide some land application monitoring service providers. You have to find some of them. Transport supplier who can transport sludge from the wastewater treatment plant up to the farmers. And this is possible if the quality of the sludge is in good agreement with agronomic point of view, and the sludge is not contaminated by some micropollutant. If not, you have to find some other way to use sludge, and it could be landfill contractor, even if now it's less and less used in France. All the characterization of the sludge should be performed by an accredited analytical laboratory. And of course, you have to provide a list of the end user, the farmer, involved in spreading campaign. The general scheme that is in this 1998 order is a specific recommendation for sludge use based on a spreading program you have to define, which concern the type of crop, because you have to define on which plot and on what surfaces you will spread sludge. And you have to take into account the return period between two sludge applications on the same plot. It depends also on the crop you will use, and I'll give you some information about that on other fertilizer input that are needed, because we'll see that sludge couldn't cover the nutrient needs for the crop as itself. And in France, you have to make a budget after 10 years of sludge application that is equivalent to 30 tons dry weight per hectare of sludge. That means you can spread more than 3 tons each year on 1 hectare. There's also some characterization of the soil on the agronomic point of view, because you have to determine the nitrogen, phosphorus, organic matter, and so on content of the soil. to calculate the quantity needed for the crop, but also you have to follow the concentration of trace element content, 7 of them, and finally you have to characterize the sludge to give the quantity you will spread, the agronomical potential of the sludge, which is the most important, and to take into account the contamination by trace metals, PCBs, and PHEs. I give you here some value, but I won't go in details for such values. But in the 1988 orders, it's providing the strict value you have to follow for the agronomic point of view of the sludge, because this is the most important. The sludge should be in good agreement with the quantity of organic matter, total phosphorus or organic nitrogen that it could bring to the soil. If not, it can be used. But also, the sludge should present some contamination by trace metal less than these thresholds in red. And this is some important point. If you spread sludge on meadow, you have to measure selenium, and the threshold is 25 milligram per kilogram of dry weight of the sludge. For organic pollutant, it's quite surprising when you know how it evolved the contamination by pollutant. But in France, we take into account only 7 PCBs and 3 PHEs. And the green figures are if you spread your sludge on meadow. It's some smaller value. But as I said before, you have to take into account the quality of the sludge, but also the quality of the soil. It's very important because not all the soil can be amended with sewage sludge. And here are the same way. The agronomic feature you have to measure before to spread sludge on the soil, and to measure the contamination of trace metal content in your soil, because if you are higher than those values in red, you cannot spread sludge on this type of soil, because it's considered as to be highly contaminated. So if you put some sludge, you will increase the quantity of trace metal, and there will be some problem with the crop. As I told you before, there is some maximum cumulative flow of sludge within 10 years, and this is calculated in gram per square meter. So I give you the different figures in purple, and as previously, if you spread of meadow, you have to measure selenium and the quantity of selenium brought by the sludge to the soil. Same for PCBs, fluorantine, benzobifluorancine, and benzoapyrene. In France, the main issue we have is the content of PHEs, because what is degrading the quality of sludge is not the heavy metal content, but more the PHEs content. As I told you in the beginning of my presentation, the quantity of nutrient that will be brought by the by the sludge to the soil for the crop is not enough for the crop development. Therefore, you have to first to calculate the doses of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium to be applied per crop, so it's crop depending. Then there is some calculation. I give you some example. The dose required for the soil is the requirement by the crop minus the supplies. And here I'm not sure that it's easy to read, but what is most important is here the figures, because for example, the quantity of phosphorus brought by this sludge is enough for the crop, but the quantity for nitrogen or potassium is not enough. That means you have to amend your soil with chemical fertilizer. So it's even if you use sludge, you have to use in a smallest quantity, but you have to put some chemicals on your soil. All the figures and all the story I told you so far, it's from methodological guides, unfortunately in French, but there are 3 of them. The first one is about the preliminary spreading study that explains how to perform this study. Then there is a guide about agronomic assessment of spreading. And finally, the pre-spreading program. And all these are very interesting because they are, the first one is for the owner of the wastewater treatment plant, and the second one is for the farmers. Let's move to composting because, as I told you at the beginning, composting is 50% of the sludge management in France today. So the composting is, there is a law in France since 2002 because we developed an AFNOR standard, which is a French standard, NFU 44095, which is relating to the compost containing materials of agronomic interest derived from wastewater treatment. The idea of this French standard is to improve the final quality of the product, to make sure that there is a greater social acceptability of the use of compost, and to diversify the outlets. That means not only agricultural purposes. So when we are speaking about composting is always a mixture of sewage sludge mixed with a co-product structurant with a green waste. You mix them. There is an active composting phase. Then you screen, and the screening reject are mixed with the mixed at the beginning, and the screening is maturate, which produce the compost that can be used and can be launched on market. And you have, as well as for the sludge spreading, to define the spreading plan. There is some level of contamination you can't overcome. And if you see the figures, it's more convenient if you want to use compost than sludge. So there is a need to select the sludge that can be used for compost, because you can't dilute, because you could decrease the level of contamination by dilution, but it's not possible. So you have to select the type of sludge that could be compost, because the mixed, you can there's some values you can overcome for the mix between green waste and sludge. So the main requirement of the French standard is a need for results requirement, because on the final composition of the product in terms of quality and safety. The monitoring requirement, so batch by batch, there is an aspect very important, which is traceability from raw material to finished products. And there are also labeling requirement just to for the consumer. And I give you 2 types of compost. The one in red is the Tradisol, which is a compost mixed green waste and sludge, and you can see it through the label NFU 44095, whereas a compost made only based on green waste is the NFU 44051. To finish with the methanization, more and more, as I told you, in France, the methanization is creating in importance. For those who were here on Wednesday afternoon, and if you hear the presentation from our colleague Florence Weber, in our wastewater treatment plant, they built a methanization facility in which they produce methane and CO2, and they can use methane as usually for fuel, town gas system, or so on, but they also use CO2 for the production of soda gas, which is not common. So far in France, there is more than 100 wastewater treatment plants which are equipped with a methanizer facility. And the idea is that there is more than 400 wastewater treatment plants that could be used to potentially produce methane in the following years. As a conclusion, what is important to retain is that the sludge management is constantly evolving and a constantly evolving process. That means you have to follow the evolution of the regulation, because, for instance, in France, there is some regulation from France, but also from Europe. So if you follow those regulations, you have to move from different management to another. And over the last 40 years, sludge management has evolved in line, as I said, with the regulatory change. Landfilling has virtually disappeared in France. Compost production is expanding rapidly. And I told you that the urban wastewater directive is going to be recast. And there's some worries by the wastewater treatment manager, because there is some modification in this future directive due to the introduction of new parameters for sludge characterization, such as dioxins, and with more stringent threshold for meters. Just an example of the consequence of the modification of the level or the new thresholds for dioxins. For the Paris region, if you can't see the value, but it's 20 picogram per kilogram of dry weight of dioxin in the sludge. If this one is the one that will be used by the Europe, for the Paris region, 50% of the sludge can no longer be spread. So we have to find another way to manage sludge. And this is my final words.
Thank you very much, Régis, for this experience from the France.